Before we were talking about the sun and what we call the stable sun, or the way the sun normally is. But now what we want to do is talk about what we call the active sun, because the sun can actually be way more active than we had been talking about. I mean, if you imagine something as violent as granules, blobs of Texas coming up, bursting and sinking in a few minutes, or super granules, the size blobs of gas the size of the Earth coming up and sinking in a few hours, or spicules shooting up for tens of thousands of kilometers in just minutes. All that's the quiet sun. So now we're going to talk about the active sun, periods of activity. The most obvious period of activity that we notice is that the sun goes through cycles of sunspots. So sometimes you look at the sun that has lots of spots, and sometimes very few spots. So the picture on the left shows very few spots. The picture on the right shows more spots. Here's actually pictures we took here on campus using telescopes at the CCC Northeast Campus. And this was back a number of years ago when the sun was covered in lots of spots. Right now, the sun has almost no spots. It's got very few spots on it. Astronomers realize that the sun sometimes has lots of spots, sometimes few spots, but it's not random. It kind of comes and goes. And so one of the things we've noticed is that it peaks about every 11 years. So we call that the solar max, maximum of sunspots. And here's a graph that shows the sunspots here from about the mid-1700s on up through the end of the 20th century. And you notice that they're not all the same. Some of the sunspot maxima are very small, and some of the sunspot maxima are very large. And so sometimes you have at maximum a huge number of spots, other times not a huge number of spots. One thing you notice is for most of the 20th century, there was a general upward trend in solar activity. Okay. Study of sunspots has been around for some time, but it really got going in the early 20th century when American astronomer E. Maunder was studying sunspots, and he makes these graphs in which he graphs the latitude of the sunspot and the days of the sunspots. And over time, he notices that sunspots at the beginning of a sunspot cycle tend to be at very high latitudes, and as the days pass or the years pass, they get closer and closer to the equator. So the last few sunspots of a sunspot group are right near the equator. So he calls these Maunder butterfly diagrams because they vaguely look like little butterflies flying down the graph paper. Here we have a correlation between Maunder butterfly diagrams in the upper plot and a graph of average number of sunspots in the lower plot. And again, you can sort of see that sometimes you have lots of sunspots, sometimes fewer sunspots, but on average, the peaks of each of these corresponds roughly with the middle of each butterfly. The minima correspond to the space between butterflies. Here's kind of a recent butterfly diagram, not the most recent one, but some kind of recent ones that show sunspots. Overall, sunspots have been watched since Galileo looked at the sun, but they started seriously being studied in the mid 1700s, the middle of the 18th century, and so they started being studied on a daily basis from that point on. And so we call the first sunspot maximum at that time cycle number 1, and then cycle number 2, and so forth. Obviously, cycle 1 was not the very first cycle that happened, and so we've recently ended the 24th cycle down here. And so right around, right now we're at the bottom here, so we're just about to start the 25th cycle. So, but we are in a deep minimum here. There's a really deep minimum between the 23rd cycle and the 24th cycle. And so that has actually been one of the deepest minimum that we've seen in hundreds of years. In fact, throughout most of the 20th century, the cycles are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then right towards the end of the 20th century, they started dropping again. So beginning of the 21st century, we've had far fewer sunspots at sunspot maxima. Indications are that the 25th cycle is probably not going to be any different. Um, First sunspot cycle here, that's cycle number 1 in the middle of the 1700s. Obviously, it wasn't the very first cycle, but right about then, about 1750 or so, is when they started doing daily sunspot measurements of the sun. Before that, they were kind of spotty. Some astronomers noticed them and reported what they saw. Others didn't. It wasn't very consistent. Nonetheless, E. Maunder started plotting this and noticed that there was kind of an up-down trend here. And so sometimes you had a period of a lot of sunspots, and then other times the maxima weren't as much. And so he noticed here, for example, what called the Dalton minimum, named after an astronomer that studied why there weren't really sunspots then. So Maunder started looking at historical records all the way back to Galileo in the early 1600s and reconstructing what the sunspot cycle looked like before the daily reporting that started in the mid 1700s. And what he realized was there was a period of time in here in which there was like hardly any sunspots. It was a big deal if the sun even had a spot for about 60 or 70 years. And so we call that the Maunder Minimum. And the interesting thing is that the Maunder Minimum is probably not the only time the sun ever did that. And we'll get back to why that's important. So here's astronomers all over the world keep track of the sun. And so here's a fairly recent plot of solar activity. And so the blue lines are what it's actually doing, and then the red lines are like a running average. And you notice that sometimes a sunspot maximum has a single peak, and sometimes, like the last few, it kind of peaks, drops down, goes back up again, so you have a double peak. We're not exactly sure why that's the case. Interesting thing happened when they were studying the sun and from Skylab in the 1970s. They realized that the total energy output of the sun was not constant. It actually varied a little bit. And so when they launched the Solar Max satellite following that to study the sun, one of the things it was measuring is the solar irradiance. Irradiance is the total energy output of the sun, and compare that to the number of sunspots. And the graph in the lower right here indicates that when there's fewer sunspots, the sun actually radiates less energy, so it's cooler then. Now that's interesting because you remember the Maunder minimum. So the light color line in this graph is actually number of sunspots, and the dark color line is one you've seen a whole bunch. That's average temperature of the Earth. And so what we see is that during the Maunder minimum, when there were very few sunspots, the temperature of the Earth actually cooled a little bit. This is sometimes called the Little Ice Age. Now, and so it kind of makes sense if the sun is shining a little bit more, then it tends to be a little bit warmer. That pattern carried on through the first half of the 20th century when, as the sun was gradually getting more sunspots on average, it turned out to be getting warmer. Now, if you notice that, that means the Earth is warming possibly because the sun's getting more active. But you remember we also showed that after this, towards the end of the 20th century, the solar activity started dropping a little bit, but the Earth did not start cooling at that point. So that suggests that maybe there's other factors that are involved. The whole global warming issue. It's partly due to the sun possibly, and partly due to human activity. During the early part of the 20th century, probably back from about the 17th century up into the early 20th century, solar activity might have dominated, but after that, human activity began to dominate. We'll get more onto that a little bit later.